Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. If you love uncovering the forgotten truths of American history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a journey into the past. Today, we're diving into a story hidden in rare photographs, images that reveal the America most history books never showed us. These pictures don't just capture moments, they shatter the myths we thought we knew about our past. Asterisk, there are moments in American history that we think we know by heart. Images etched into textbooks, memories painted in black and white, stories told by grandparents who lived through hard winters, wars, or years of promise. But every now and then, a photograph appears that quietly unsettles those neat little stories. It forces us to see again, not with the polished gloss of nostalgia or the tidy summaries of history books, but with raw truth. These rare photographs, often tucked away in archives or family trunks, can undo the myths we cling to about who we were, how we lived, and what America really felt like in its earlier days. Take, for instance, the golden image of the American small town at the turn of the century. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. Main Street lined with brick stores, the barber pole spinning slowly, kids chasing a hoop with a stick, women carrying baskets of bread from the bakery. We imagine it as simple, innocent, and pure America, before modern life complicated everything. And yet, a photograph taken in 1908 in a small coal town in Pennsylvania tells a different story. The photo is plain, unadorned. Children not older than 8 or 9 years old stand barefoot in front of a dark mine shaft. Their faces are smudged with coal dust, their eyes tired and aged far beyond their years. Their hands, though tiny, are gnarled and calloused from long hours underground. This single photo tears apart the myth of a purely innocent, worry-free childhood in the early 1900s. Childhood, for so many, was short-lived. These boys had no time for games in the street or afternoons of schoolhouse laughter. They rose before the sun and worked until the whistle blew, their small bodies swallowed by a world of danger and hard labor. It's an image that humbles us, because it reminds us that our beloved grandparents or great-grandparents may have lived childhoods more brutal than we can ever imagine. But history is not just hardship, it's also contradiction. Another photo, taken around the same decade, shows a 4th of July parade in a bustling Midwest town. The street is crowded with flags, bunting draped across wooden storefronts, a marching band in crisp uniforms leading the way. Behind them come farmers with their horses, children waving little flags, women in white dresses carrying baskets of flowers. The photo radiates pride, belonging, and joy. And yet, if you look closer, at the corners, at the margins, you notice something unsettling. Standing on the sidelines are groups of immigrants who had just arrived from Europe: Italians, Poles, Irish. Their faces are somber, uncertain, out of place. They are not draped in red, white, and blue. Many of them look as though they are watching someone else's celebration, unsure if they truly belong. That photo whispers a truth we don't always want to hear. America's sense of unity, its patriotic celebrations, always existed side by side with unease, with tension about who was really American. Nostalgia tells us that everyone stood together, shoulder to shoulder. The photograph tells us something messy, that belonging was often contested, that the dream of America was as much about hope as it was about exclusion. And isn't that the strange power of these hidden photographs? They allow us to touch the real heartbeat of history, not the polished version. They show us joy and pain living side by side. They remind us that people back then were complicated, like us, capable of laughter on one street and tears on the next. Another photo, taken during the Great Depression, makes this even clearer. We've all seen the iconic images: men standing in bread lines, families riding broken-down trucks across dust-choked roads, mothers holding their children with weary eyes. But one rarely seen photo, tucked into the archives of the Library of Congress, reveals a softer, stranger moment. It shows a family gathered in a shack in Oklahoma. The walls are patched with newspaper. The floor is bare earth. Yet in the middle of the room, under a single dangling light bulb, the family sits in a circle, laughing. A boy strums a battered guitar. His sister claps her hands. The mother, thin as she is, claps along with a smile that we don't expect laughter in the Great Depression. We expect only grim faces, hunger, despair. But here was joy, not because life was easy, but because people found ways to survive not only with their bodies, but with their spirits intact. That photo, more than any other, destroys the myth that the Depression was only suffering. Yes, it was suffering, but it was also resilience, humor, music, and a stubborn refusal to let hard times erase every trace of joy. And yet, while some photos reveal hidden strength, others lay bare pain that we often forget. Take one from 1917, during World War I. The photo shows a send-off parade for young American soldiers heading to Europe. Crowds line the streets, waving flags, cheering, throwing flowers. In the center of the frame, two young men march proudly. In uniform, their shoulders are squared, their chins lifted high. But what grabs you is not the soldiers. It's the mother in the corner of the frame. She is clutching her apron, her face twisted in grief, her eyes locked on the son she is about to lose to the war. No one is looking at her. The crowd celebrates. But she knows the truth. Pride and sacrifice come with unbearable cost. That photograph reminds us that wars, though wrapped in banners and anthems, are carried in the broken hearts of ordinary families. Every flag waved was also a goodbye. Every cheer was mixed with fear. We forget that in the triumph of history, in the telling of victories, there were always mothers who wept quietly in kitchens, wives who stared out windows for letters that never came, children who grew up without fathers. Photographs like these work like time machines. They don't just show us what the past looked like, they show us what it felt like. And often, those feelings are not the ones we expect. We expect simplicity, but we find contradiction. We expect innocence, but we find hardship. We expect unity, but we find tension. And in all of it, we discover that history is not a clean story told in straight lines. It is messy, human, full of shadows and light. Still, perhaps the most haunting photographs are those that show us things we never thought were preserved at all. One such photo was found in an attic in Mississippi. It's a faded picture of a one-room schoolhouse in the 1920s. Rows of black children sit at rough wooden desks, their faces bright, their clothes worn. The chalkboard behind them is cracked, the floor uneven. But the children are smiling, eyes wide with pride. They are learning to read, to write, to count. And yet, just down the road, a white schoolhouse, bigger, brighter, filled with books and supplies, told a different story of America. This photo shatters the myth of equal opportunity in early America. It forces us to confront how deeply divided the country was, even in something as simple and vital as a child's education. But it also speaks to something remarkable: the determination of children, parents, and teachers who refuse to let injustice steal their hope. Those children, underfed and overlooked, were still dreaming of futures bigger than the walls around them. The more we look at these hidden photographs, the more we realize that history is not about tidy legends. It is about real lives lived in all their fullness. A photograph of a factory floor in Chicago shows women in aprons working long hours, hair tied back, hands stained with grease. They are laughing at a joke, shoulders leaning into one another. It's not the story we expect of industrial America, which we often picture as grim and joyless. Instead, the photo captures a sisterhood, a bond of women who found light in each other even in the grind of labor. Another photo shows a farm family in Kansas in 1912. They stand beside their wooden house, the father with a pitchfork, the mother with a baby in her arms, the children lined up by size. It's a scene that feels familiar, almost like a painting of pioneer life. But if you look closer, you notice the dirt under their nails, the weariness in their eyes, the makeshift patches on their clothes. This was not romantic frontier life. It was grueling, day after day, with every scrap of survival earned by calloused hands. The myth of the self-sufficient farmer, cheerful and strong, fades when you see the cost of such a life etched into their faces. And yet, the same photograph, the same weary faces, also reveal a kind of pride. They had little, but they had each other. They had land that was theirs, however stubborn and dry it might be. The photo captures that tension perfectly. Hardship and dignity standing side by side, inseparable. Photographs, perhaps more than any other record of history, force us to abandon the myths. They ask us to see, to really see, not the polished story, not the nostalgia of memory, but the truth of lives lived, messy, beautiful, painful, enduring. And once you've seen, you cannot go back to the myths, because the truth is, America's past was never one thing. It was not only innocence or only hardship. It was not only unity or only division. It was both. And in the black and white stillness of these photographs, we can almost hear the heartbeat of those who lived before us. We can hear their laughter in the dark, their cries in the quiet, their determination in the face of impossible odds. And in their faces, we see not strangers, but echoes of ourselves. The story of America is too often told in fragments, polished down into slogans or grand scenes of triumph. But when you open an old box of forgotten photographs, what you find are not monuments or speeches, but faces. Faces that hold pain, pride, stubbornness, and dreams. And sometimes, those faces tell us truths that history has tried to soften. One of the most striking examples comes from the 1930s, when the Works Progress Administration sent photographers across the country to document American life. One image, hidden deep in the archives for years, shows a group of migrant workers outside Bakersfield, California. They sit in the dirt, their clothes torn, their cheeks sunburned, their hands rough from picking fruit. At first glance, it seems like just another photo of Dust Bowl refugees. But look closer, and you see the women's eyes. They are not defeated. They are staring at the camera with a look of defiance, almost anger, as if daring history itself to erase them. That photograph reminds us that the people who suffered the most during the Depression were not only victims, they were fighters, determined to be seen, even when the country wanted to look away. But not every photograph of that time speaks of defiance. Some show a softer, heartbreaking kind of endurance. Another rare picture from 1933 shows a soup kitchen in Chicago. Men line up outside in coats too thin for winter, their hands stuffed deep in their pockets against the cold. But at the center of the frame is a man holding his son's hand. The boy is no older than 6, his tiny feet barely touching the icy ground. The man's eyes look down, ashamed, unable to meet the lens of the camera. It's the kind of image that destroys the myth that poverty was only a matter of failed men or idle drifters. Here was a father, carrying his child through humiliation, just trying to put food in a small stomach. That photograph is not about statistics or policy. It is about love wrapped in shame, about a father who will do anything to protect his son, even when the world gives him nothing. And then, there are photographs from the war years that bend what we thought we knew. World War II is often remembered in blazing color, flags waving, soldiers smiling, victory parades filling the streets. But hidden among the propaganda posters and victory gardens are photographs that speak of a more complicated truth. One such image comes from 1942, just after Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes and enter internment camps. The photo shows a small girl standing in front of a schoolhouse in California, holding the American flag during a morning pledge. She stands tall, her little hand pressed against her chest, the flag nearly larger than she is. The children around her recite in unison. And yet, within weeks, she and her family would be shipped off to live behind barbed wire. That photograph is shattering because it collapses the myth of World War II as a time of pure national unity. While young men fought overseas for freedom, families like hers were losing their freedom right here at home. The image forces us to sit with the contradiction. A child pledging allegiance to a country that was about to betray her. That contradiction is history's truth, and photographs like this do not let us forget it. Even photographs meant to inspire sometimes reveal something unintended. A famous picture shows Rosie the Riveter types, women in bandanas, sleeves rolled up, working in factories to build planes and tanks. It has long been celebrated as a symbol of empowerment, and rightly so. But a rarely seen photo from a Michigan factory in 1944 shows another angle. The women are bent over assembly lines there, faces blank with exhaustion, their hands raw from endless shifts. A sign on the wall behind them reads, "Keep production up, every minute counts." It was empowerment, yes, but also relentless strain. These women weren't simply symbols. They were tired mothers, daughters, sisters carrying two burdens at once: the burden of war work and the burden of keeping families alive at home. The myth of easy empowerment melts when you see the toll written in their posture. Some of the most powerful photos from that era are not from the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but from the quiet corners of American life. A photograph, taken in 1943 in Harlem, shows a group of black soldiers on leave, dressed in crisp uniforms, standing proudly on the sidewalk. Children gaze up at them with wide eyes, seeing heroes. But beside them stands a sign for a whites-only establishment, and the soldiers' faces hold a strange mix of pride and weariness. They were willing to fight and die for a country that did not treat them as equals. That photograph strips bare the myth of a war fought for freedom abroad. It reminds us that freedom was still unfinished here at home. And yet, even in the hardest truths, there are flashes of beauty. Another wartime photo shows a dance hall in Kansas, filled with soldiers and young women twirling to swing music. The air is alive with laughter, with motion, with the sheer joy of youth burning brightly in uncertain times. You can almost hear the trumpet and the stomping of feet. These photographs remind us that even when history was at its darkest, people carved out moments of joy. The myth of wartime as only sacrifice fades when you see that even in shadow, there was music and laughter. After the war, photographs continued to reveal cracks in the story we like to tell about the 1950s, the so-called Golden Age. Textbooks show us shiny cars, tidy suburbs, and smiling families around the dinner table. But one photo, taken in 1954, tells another story. It shows a small Appalachian shack where a mother and 5 children huddle around a wood stove. The father is gone, working in the mines. The children wear hand-me-downs so thin you can see their knees through the fabric. Outside, the world was buying televisions and shiny appliances, but in that shack, poverty was as raw as it had ever been. That image shatters the myth of universal prosperity. It tells us that while some families were living the American dream, others were still clawing their way through the American struggle. Another photo, from 1955, shows something both painful and inspiring. A group of young black children walk into a school in Arkansas, their heads held high, their books clutched tightly, as angry crowds jeer behind them. We all know the story of desegregation, but seeing it frozen in a photograph, the fear in the children's eyes, the fury in the crowd's faces, makes the myth of peaceful progress collapse. Change was never polite, never easy. It was brave children walking through fire so that others could learn freely tomorrow. That single image tells us more about courage than any speech ever could. And then, there are the quiet family photos that never made it to newspapers. Pictures of soldiers coming home from Korea, hugging wives and children on train platforms. A father lifting his daughter high in the air as though he had never let her go. These images shatter another myth, the myth that history is only about presidents, generals, and laws. The truth is that history has always lived in the arms of ordinary families, in the quiet reunions, in the small joys that never made headlines but shaped lives forever. Some photographs are haunting precisely because they were never meant to be public. A recently discovered set of images from a South Carolina mill in the 1950s shows workers sleeping at their machines during night shifts. Their exhaustion is heavy, their faces slack, their bodies bent. These men and women kept the gears of America turning, but the myth of post-war prosperity never included them. They were the shadows behind the gleaming promise, the ones who worked until they broke, unseen, unheard, but vital to the story of America. Even photographs of play can break apart our illusions. A picture from the late 1940s shows a group of children playing baseball in a vacant lot in Detroit. Their bats are broom handles, their bases old shoes, their gloves mismatched. The photo is filled with laughter, with kids mid-swing and mid-run. And yet, in the background, a factory smokes, and the buildings around them sag with decay. It reminds us that childhood joy has always bloomed, even in hardship. The myth of a perfect, carefree childhood fades, but what replaces it is even more powerful. The truth that joy is resilient, that kids can create a world of play even among ruins. As we look at these rare and hidden photographs, a pattern emerges. The myths we tell ourselves about the past are always too clean. They sand away the dirt, the pain, the contradictions. But the photographs refuse to let us forget. They show us that America was always many things at once: pride and shame, joy and sorrow, unity and division. To see these images is to understand that the past is not behind us. It lives inside us still, and perhaps that is why these photographs matter so deeply. Because they remind us that history was never about perfect moments frozen in time. It was about people, messy and complicated, stumbling forward, carrying hope and heartbreak in equal measure. And when we see them clearly, stripped of myth, we see ourselves more clearly too. By the time the 1960s arrived, America was already carrying a long trail of contradictions. We remember the decade now as a whirlwind of change, a storm of protests and marches, a clash of old and new. The photographs left behind from those years are some of the most powerful ever taken. They don't just capture events. They capture emotions so raw, so unguarded, that they cut through the myths we've wrapped around that time. One photograph, taken in Birmingham in 1963, shows a group of young black children being blasted by a fire hose during a civil rights march. The water knocks them off their feet, their small bodies flung against the sidewalk. Their faces are twisted in pain, but there is also something unyielding in their stance. It is an image that shatters the myth that change came slowly, politely, through reasoned debate. No, change was demanded by children willing to stand against hoses, dogs, and nightsticks. That photograph tells us the truth. Progress was born from suffering, courage, and unimaginable sacrifice. And yet, in the same era, another photo shows a very different story. In a small Midwestern town in 1964, a parade winds down Main Street. Families line the sidewalks, smiling as the high school band marches by in shiny uniforms. Kids lick ice cream cones. The storefronts are decorated with flags and streamers. If you only looked at that picture, you'd believe the myth that the 1960s were all innocence and patriotism, untouched by the unrest in bigger cities. But history is never so simple. That town, too, was touched by fear, by suspicion, by the quiet unease of a country divided. The photo doesn't show the arguments at kitchen tables, the whispered worries about war and change, the way television was bringing images of violence into homes that had never seen such things before. Even in small towns, the storm was coming. There is a photograph from 1967 that captures that storm in a single frame. A young man in Detroit stands shirtless in the street, his fists clenched, smoke rising behind him from buildings set ablaze. During the uprising, his expression is one of fury, but also of desperation. Behind him, a National Guardsman aims his rifle, his body rigid with fear. The image destroys the myth of the 1960s as only a decade of peace and love. It was also a decade of fire, of cities shaking under the weight of injustice, of young men caught between hopelessness and rage. That single photograph forces us to see both sides of the American story, the demand for dignity and the fear of chaos. But the 1960s were not only about conflict. There are photographs of extraordinary tenderness, too. In 1969, when the moon landing transfixed the world, a photo taken in Harlem shows a group of children huddled around a small black and white television in a crowded living room. Their eyes are wide, their mouths slightly open as they watch the astronauts take steps on the moon. The room is dim, the furniture worn, but the wonder on those children's faces glows brighter than any lamp. That photo cuts through the myth that the space race belonged only to scientists, politicians, or astronauts. It belonged to every child who looked up at the night sky and believed that something bigger was possible. And then came Vietnam. The war is remembered in headlines, speeches, and numbers. But the photographs from that time pierced deeper than any statistic ever could. One of the most haunting shows a soldier sitting alone in a jungle clearing, his helmet off, his face buried. In his hands, his rifle leans beside him, but his body looks broken, as though the weight of it all is crushing him. That picture shatters the myth of soldiers as unshakable heroes. They were young men, barely more than boys, sent into a nightmare they could barely understand. They carried not just rifles, but unbearable loneliness, fear, and sorrow. Back home, another photograph shows the other side of that story. At a protest in Washington, D.C., in 1971, a young woman places a daisy into the barrel of a soldier's rifle. The photograph has become famous, But what is less remembered is the look on the soldier's face. He is not angry. He is not cold. His eyes seem almost sad, as if he is torn between duty and doubt. That image unravels the myth that the war was simply protesters versus soldiers. It was far more complicated. Many soldiers were themselves uncertain, torn, longing to be anywhere else but where history had put them. Some of the most powerful Vietnam-era photographs don't show the war at all, but its aftermath. One rare picture from 1972 captures a mother in Ohio holding a folded American flag after her son's death. She is sitting alone on a porch, her eyes hollow, the flag pressed tightly against her chest. There are no parades, no speeches, no politicians by her side. Just grief, silent and consuming. That photograph burns away the myth that sacrifice is noble and glorious. It shows the truth that every war leaves behind broken families who carry the cost long after the guns go quiet. Yet not all photographs from that era are heavy. Some sparkle with the joy of a changing world. One picture from 1974 shows a group of teenagers roller skating down a suburban street, their bell-bottom jeans flapping, their hair wild, their faces carefree. The sun is setting, casting long shadows, and the whole scene feels alive with the freedom of youth. That image shatters the myth that the 1970s were only a time of cynicism and disillusionment. Yes, the country was weary from war and scandal, but young people were still chasing joy, still carving out their own version of the American dream in laughter and music. Other photos remind us that beneath the surface of ordinary life, history was shifting in ways people could barely understand at the time. A photograph from 1976 shows a bicentennial celebration in Philadelphia. Crowds wave flags, fireworks explode in the sky, children wear red, white, and blue hats. It looks like a perfect picture of national pride. But if you look closer at the edges of the frame, you see protesters holding signs about unemployment, about civil rights still unfinished, about the costs of war. The photograph forces us to accept a truth we often ignore. Even in moments of celebration, America's divisions never vanished. They simply stood at the edges, waiting to be seen. And so it has always been. Photographs capture not just what was staged to be remembered, but what slipped into the frame by accident. In those accidents, in those raw truths, the myths we tell ourselves about the past begin to crumble. That be why the late 1970s, America was a country trying to recover, trying to make sense of its wounds. Photographs from factory towns in decline show men leaving plants with lunch pails in their hands, their faces lined with worry as jobs disappeared overseas. They don't look like the confident breadwinners of post-war advertisements. They look tired, unsure of what the future will hold. Those images erase the myth that America's strength was unshakable. They remind us that even the strongest industries, the mightiest cities, could falter at the same time. Photographs of immigrant families arriving from Latin America and Asia show another side of the story, hope. One photo from 1978 shows a family stepping off a bus in Los Angeles, the parents clutching bags, the children holding onto each other, their eyes wide with both fear and excitement. That photograph breaks the myth that the American story had already been written. No, it was still being written, every day, in the footsteps of families arriving with nothing but dreams. The decade closed. A photograph taken in a small diner in Nebraska in 1979 captured the feeling of a nation at a crossroads. A group of farmers sit at a counter, their hats pulled low, their cups of coffee steaming. The waitress leans in, smiling gently, while the men sit in silence, their faces heavy with unspoken worry. Outside, the snow piles high against the windows. The photo radiates a quiet dignity, but also uncertainty. It tells us that history is not always about explosions and parades. Sometimes it is about silence, about the weight of change felt in the stillness of an ordinary morning. Looking through these hidden photographs, the myths fall away piece by piece. The myth of endless prosperity, the myth of easy unity, the myth of heroes untouched by doubt. What remains is something more real, more human, and, in a way, more beautiful. For in the cracks of those myths, we see the truth that America has always been a story of struggle and resilience, of division and togetherness, of sorrow and joy. And that truth, however complicated, is what makes the story worth telling. By the time the 1980s and 1990s arrived, America had already lived through so much change that it was hard to keep track of what was myth and what was memory. We often speak of those years as a time of prosperity, of neon lights, booming cities, and a nation finding its swagger again after the shadows of war and recession. But the hidden photographs of those decades tell a more complicated story, one of joy, yes, but also of loss, of struggle, of a country still wrestling with the contradictions it had carried for generations. Point one photograph from 1981 shows a wall. Street trading floor, men in suits shouting into telephones, arms waving wildly in a frenzy of profit. Their faces glow with ambition, with the fever of money. This is the image most of us remember when we think of the 1980s, a nation driven by wealth, by excess, by the promise that anyone could rise to the top. But tucked away in another collection is a photograph taken that very same year, hundreds of miles away in a small Ohio town. It shows a line of men at a shuttered steel mill, their lunch pails empty, their faces hollowed by fear. Their clothes are neat, their hair combed, but their eyes tell another story entirely. These were men who had worked for decades, believing that loyalty and hard labor would protect them. But the mill was gone, the jobs shipped away, and the myth of endless American prosperity collapsed in the silence of that line. Another photograph from the 1980s takes us far from the steel mills and into the heart of the farm crisis. In one rare picture, a farmer in Iowa leans against a tractor with his head bowed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of debt and drought. Behind him, his wife holds their small daughter, her face turned toward the ground. It's a photo, so raw, so quiet, that it almost hurts to look at. Because the myth of America's farmers is one of unshakable strength, of men and women tied to the land with unbreakable pride. But this picture tells us something harder. Pride does not pay the bank. Strength does not guarantee rain. And families, no matter how sturdy, can break under the weight of forces they cannot control. But not all photographs from the 1980s are heavy. Some remind us of the ordinary joys that threaded their way through hardship. A picture taken at a block party in Brooklyn in 1983 shows children breakdancing on cardboard laid out on the sidewalk. Their friends cheer, their smiles wide, the music spilling out from a boombox perched nearby. The backdrop is cracked pavement and graffiti-splashed walls, but the energy is electric, alive with invention. That photograph shatters the myth that joy only belongs to the wealthy or to times of ease. Joy has always belonged to those who seize it, who create it out of nothing but rhythm, laughter, and community. Another rare image from 1985 captures a family of Vietnamese refugees gathered around a dinner table in Houston. The parents serve bowls of rice, the children grin, and an American flag hangs proudly on the wall behind them. Their faces shine with gratitude and determination. That photograph tells us that America's story has never stopped being rewritten. It breaks the myth that the American dream was something finished long ago. No, every family that arrived with nothing but hope carved out new dreams, adding to the story of who we are. And then came the 1990s, a decade we often remember as peaceful, prosperous, almost carefree. We picture booming technology, suburbia in full bloom, the Cold War ending with celebration. But photographs tell a deeper truth. One image from 1992 shows smoke rising over Los Angeles, streets filled with protesters, shop windows shattered after the Rodney King verdict. In the foreground, a man holds a sign that reads, "Justice for all," his face fierce with anger and grief. That photograph shatters the myth that the 1990s were free of conflict, that America had entered a calm new era. No, the old wounds of inequality and injustice were still burning, still demanding to be seen. But in the same decade, another photograph tells the other side of the story. It shows a group of children in Seattle sitting cross-legged on the floor of a classroom, gathered around a new computer. Their faces glow with wonder as they click and type for the first time, entering a digital world they could barely imagine. That picture reminds us that the 1990s were also about possibility, about the birth of a new age that would transform everything. It breaks the myth that history ends, that once a nation reaches prosperity, the story is finished. In truth, every generation stands at the edge of something new, full of fear and full of hope. Some of the most powerful photographs from the 1990s aren't of wars or protests, but of ordinary life. A rare image from 1995 shows a grandmother sitting on a porch in Mississippi, braiding her granddaughter's hair. The light is golden, the wooden boards of the porch worn smooth from years of rocking chairs and footsteps. The grandmother's hands move with steady love, while the child sits patiently, her eyes dreamy as she gazes into the distance. That photograph captures something timeless, the quiet passing down of care, of memory, of tradition. It breaks the myth that history is always loud, always dramatic. Sometimes history is as quiet as hands working through hair, as tender as love passed from one generation to the next, and then, as the 20th century drew to a close, another photograph appeared that would forever mark the turn of history. In 1999, after the Columbine tragedy, a photograph shows rows of shoes lined up on the steps of a building, each pair representing a child's life lost. The shoes sit silently, but their silence screams. That image shatters the myth that America's schools were always safe havens, untouched by violence. It reminds us that even in times of prosperity, shadows lurk and innocence can be stolen in an instant. When we step back and look across these decades, across the children in coal mines, the mothers in shacks, the soldiers in jungles, the marchers in the streets, the farmers in their fields, the families at their tables, we begin to see that the myths we were taught about the past were never the full story. Photographs, more than any textbook or speech, tell us the truth. They show us that history was always lived in color and shadow, in joy and sorrow, in triumph and in heartbreak. The myths tell us America was simple, united, endlessly strong. The photographs tell us America was complicated, divided, fragile, and yet always reaching for something greater. And maybe that is the real story. Not that we were ever perfect, but that we kept going anyway. That we laughed in the dark, sang in the silence, worked through pain, and passed on dreams even when the world seemed impossible. The hidden photographs remind us that history is not a straight line of progress or decline. It is a tapestry, woven of countless lives, each thread carrying its own weight, its own light, its own darkness. Some threads shine bright: parades, dances, laughter, discoveries. Others are dark: loss, injustice, grief. But together they create something larger, something richer, something more human than any myth could ever capture. And perhaps, when we look at these photographs, when we really let them speak, we realize that they are not just about the past. They are about us. Because the faces staring back from those images, tired, proud, hopeful, broken, they are our faces, too. Their struggles are echoes of our struggles. Their joys are echoes of our joys. Their dreams, unfinished, are the very dreams we carry. Now.so the next time we hear a polished story of the good old days, of a past that was simpler, cleaner, purer, let us remember the photographs. Let us remember the cold dust on children's cheeks, the mothers clutching flags, the fathers waiting in lines, the children walking bravely into schools where they were not wanted, the laughter in shacks, the music in dance halls, the pride in faces pressed against injustice. Let us remember that the past was never one thing. It was everything, all at once. And when we remember that, we find something deeper than myth. We find truth. And in that truth, though it is messy and painful, there is beauty, because it is real, because it belongs to us, because it reminds us that America has always been a story worth telling, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift of these hidden photographs. They do not let us look away. They do not let us forget. They show us who we were, who we are, and who we might still become.